control the vertigo.
Welcome to Anthologic, the TV anthology podcast. I am your host, Mark. Anthologic is a podcast dedicated to exploring the good, the bad, and the odd of horror, science fiction, and the best of mystery suspense anthology shows and series on TV. Join me as we slip through the cracks of reality to approach the extremes of experience, where we can peruse the stories and art of a sinister fairground of strange and wonderful rides. And now we go on to the show that is the focus of this particular episode. Welcome to this episode of Anthologic with your host Mark. Today we are finally finishing our night gallery run. There is a few, while I've covered all the actual available episodes of the original runs, there's a few extra ones that were filmed or made but not included in any episodes, because I guess, I don't know, they filmed them and decided they weren't suitable, but they did then include them apparently in some stuff they did for syndication, which I'm going to come to. So what I'll do is I'll just talk about the stories I watched on these extra vignettes, and then I'll talk about the nature of Night Gallery and why perhaps it isn't as well regarded as something like the Twilight Zone or the Outer Limits or Tales from the Crypt and so on. Right, so the particular stories I'm going to cover is called, there are three of them, two are very, very short, they're the vignette kind of ones. One is a bit longer and is unnecessarily long, and I'll go into the reasons for that as we go. Anyway, the first longer one is called Die Now, Pay Later. This got Slim Pickens in, which is kind of fancy, Slim Pickens, but he's kind of gone and talked to, he's the sheriff, and he's gone and talked to a guy that's having, an undertaker who's having a sale of all this old stock, and he's saying, undertakers don't have sales, you know, food stores have sales, and you know, he's saying, well, I've got old stock, I've got to get rid of it. And it turns out that his sales, people buying from him, is precipitating accidents and death. So it's almost like a cursed thing. And okay, so there's that. But this goes on for 14 minutes, I think, and it feels like it could be half that length. It's also padded weirdly with a black cat just wandering around and sort of almost like abstract scenes of this black cat, which has nothing to do with the story. There's a reason for this, which I'll get into. But the whole thing is a bit of a mess. It's not that. The quality I saw on was pretty bad, so maybe this was never finished, and I don't know. Maybe this is just one of those throwaway things that wasn't included in the sort of syndication process. I don't really know. Though having said that, I believe it was. Yeah, and it's got a fairly minor punchline at the end. Again, this was more like a 5-minute vignette that was padded to 14 minutes. That's kind of how it felt. It was a bit longer than some of the other sort of minute and a half jobs we've had, but there wasn't much to it, and it wasn't very good. Anyway, yes, that's that one. The next one was a short called Witch's Feast. This goes on for 5 minutes or so. Again, it could have been more like a minute and a half, where basically it's witches invoking things and going on about how hungry they are. The whole joke is they're hungry while like the head witch is kind of making a broth. Now, one thing of interest to this is Ruth Buzzy was one of the witches. Ruth Buzzy's just recently passed. She's a great presence in stuff. So, but you know, there was so much makeup overlaid the actresses in this, it was hard to tell, and I didn't specifically spot Ruth Buzzy. It was only seen her on the credits that I realised. So Witch's Face, yeah, it's an okay one. This was sometimes tanked to one of the episodes as a short at the end within season 2, were sometimes interchanged, but yeah, I got to see it in this format again. It wasn't great, it was fairly poor. Right, you can tell by the rate I'm going through these how little I think of these. Right, the final one is definitely one I thought I'd seen, but I tried to track it back, and I feel like there was something very similar. There was a very similar vignette, and maybe it wasn't exactly the same. Basically, it's an elevator one. People in an elevator, some weird monster gets in, and they mention to him that the weight load is too big. It's for 10 or less. And the guy that picks up the monster on this, and he acts like he's a perfectly normal thing, not a weird looking monster. And the monster kind of zaps him and he disappears, which makes the weight right. And then people just go out and take that's the joke. Yeah. Okay, fine. It feels like more like it should have been a Charles Addams cartoon than something in this. But yeah, okay. Now, reading a bit about the Night Gallery, there's some thoughts about why it perhaps isn't as well remembered. And I mean, these three stories are examples of perhaps why it isn't well remembered. What happened is, in its first two seasons, there was an hour consisting of several stories. What happened often was there'd be a great story and often a much lesser story or a terrible vignette to finish off the show, which leaves a memory of not very good. Unfortunately, what it means is the really good stories were often saddled with something fairly poor. Now, there is the odd episode involving several stories where everything is great. Now, that's great and that's fine, or at least decent. But quite a lot of them, there's something poor, and it's usually often at the end when it's a vignette, and it really causes the whole series to have be considered fairly poor. Now, Rod Serling himself, he was asked I think in his final interview, what piece of his work do you think is for posterity? And interestingly, he only said two particular things he worked on did he raise, and that did not include anything from the Twilight Zone, surprisingly. The things he mentioned was a teleplay he did, which kind of made his name and kind of give him the opportunity to Twilight Zone, really, which is called Requiem for a Heavyweight, a drama he penned for TV. And the second thing he mentioned is an actual story within the Night Gallery, which is they're tearing down Tom Riley's bar. So those he considered were the two most important things of his career. Interesting, a Night Gallery episode comes into that, given the sort of trouble he had with the Night Gallery. Reading about it, he hated being associated with the Night Gallery in the end because they were just putting out these terrible things, getting lower and lower ratings, but they were putting his name on it. And he just wasn't interested. Having said that, didn't stop him taking the money and doing the intros. And he continued doing it even after the series was done. And we'll get into that shortly. But he really was not pleased with how his name was associated with the Night Gallery. Right, so the story is, this is the sort of background. When they finished filming the Night Gallery, there were actually 49 episodes. However, to be syndicated, you needed 75 episodes. I don't know the whys and wherefores of American TV syndication, but that was the fact of it. So they decided what they were going to do is try and edit down the longer episodes, the stories from the longer episodes, into a shorter form and make basically 30-minute episodes that would perhaps produce 75 episodes. So they did this. They kind of chopped off. Now, what was happening, what this meant was they would often take episodes that were a bit short and pad it with something similar, but not the same. So they would pad it out to 24 minutes, right? What might have been a 15-minute episode, they, somehow by putting in long shots and putting in somehow related material. But apparently it wasn't related, which made the stories quite incoherent. The opposite happened to stories that were longer than 24 minutes. There was quite a few really good stories that were just a bit longer than 24 minutes. Or quite a bit longer, 30 odd minutes. So in those cases, they took a sort of chopping block to the story and cut stuff out in a very kind of haphazard way, from the sound of it. And then they would try and amend this by having Rod Serling record a new intro, which set up some of the backstory and explained some of the stuff that was going on. So you can imagine this didn't create a great quality series. In addition, someone decided they'd start changing the music cues. So the music, again, was changed for some reason and made it even more incoherent. In addition, once they did all of this, they still didn't have 75 episodes. So they swiveled to another series called The Sixth Sense, which was not a horror anthology or, mystery anthology series. It was a sort of a bit like an X-Files of its day, a man and a woman investigating things, but in a, episode of the week type of thing. But it was always them. But they then took some of these episodes and started editing them down to be 24 minutes, and then got Rod Serling to record intros for those. So you can imagine this gets more and more bizarre. This is a bizarre set of episodes. I've never seen any of these. I have only ever seen the original series, I'm glad to say. It would kind of be interesting, but I think it'd be depressing more than anything. Serling, I'm glad to say, got a lot of money to narrate these or add openers and closers to these episodes to try and improve it. Right, so in all, they managed to get over 75 episodes from all of this work. However, a new ruling came in, which then changed the actual 24-minute slot. And I don't know the whys and wherefores, but they changed the 24-minute slot, so it had to be 22 minutes. What this meant was station managers had to deal with that, and the way they dealt with it was by slightly increasing the speed of the videotape. So it would, what was a 24-minute story would then fit into 22 minutes by increasing it a couple of frames every 30 frames or something. I think the American system was 30 frames a second, so they increased it to 32 frames a second or something, which meant Rod Serling was kind of high-pitched, apparently, on these recordings. Can you imagine? This just sounds awful. So, for all these reasons, I think it's fair to say it's easy to see why Night Gallery is not that well regarded. Okay, what I thought I'd like to do was just mention some of what I think were the best stories. And I'm just going to really mention the names and not go into the details too much. Maybe one or two details. But I think, for me, the one that stands out the most is probably the pilot. Particularly the cemetery story with Roddy McDowall and Ozzie Davis. I think that's a great story. However, the two other stories, In Eyes and The Escape Route, are really tense and interesting. I think the pilot's a really solid sort of bit of Night Gallery and my favourite bit, I would say, personally. Other stories I really liked were they're tearing down Tom Riley's bar. I kind of talked about it when, obviously, I've talked about all of these, but this one's extremely well regarded, if not by anyone else but Rod Serling himself. He thought this was some of his finest work, the tearing down Tom Riley's bar. Another one I really liked was The Sins of the Fathers with Richard Thomas. Now, there's some wandering accents or suspect accents throughout that one, but I think the actual drama and tenseness of that one is really terrific. I really, really like that. And that comes on to Lindeman's Catch, which is the vampire story. That's is it? No, I'm sorry, I'm confused it with another one. Lindeman's Catch, I think, is a really interesting one. Stuart Whitman stars in that. There's something about that. That's from season 2 as well. So far, Tearing Down Tom Riley's Bar was season 1, but Sins of the Fathers and Lindeman's Catch was season 2. Another one I kind of liked, if not just to see Elsa Lanchester in something else. Elsa Lanchester, the original Bride of Frankenstein, playing a sort of a slightly dotty old lady gardener in Green Fingers, again from season 2. That brings me on to a couple that were basically adaptations of H.P. Lovecraft stories, which was Cool Air and Pickman's Model. I thought they were very, very solid. And I quite like the fact they tackle some Lovecraft in these. I enjoy that. There's some movies from the early 70s around Lovecraft, like the Dunwich Horror and I think The Haunted Palace. That's a bit earlier. They're pretty cool. And these two were solid stories. I also really quite enjoyed The Caterpillar from season 2. Lawrence Harvey is like this. Again, for some reason, this series often turned to Africa for a sort of inspiration point. There's various stories about it, and The Caterpillar is one of those. The endings kind of a belter. It's probably one of the classiest endings. I think Stephen King actually talks about this specific episode or story within his great work about a non-fiction work about the nature of horror, Danse Macabre, and he does mention this one. I quite liked it. Most of these are season 2, it has to be said. Deliveries at the Rear, I quite like that one. That was kind of shenanigans with gangsters and sort of a guy who kind of offers to be able to get rid of them, but it turns out his way of getting rid of, helping people disappear, is way more startling than you think. Let's put it that way. Another one I liked from season 1 was The Doll. Creepy dolls, always good. Setting kind of... Again, I mentioned that Twilight Zone often kind of twists to Africa. It also often twists to sort of England and English stuff and possibly past history of England. And The Doll is kind of that. Creepy dolls, what's not to like? Another one I liked from season 2 was The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes with Clint Howard. I think this is a really interesting, solid one. It kind of reminds me of a bit of Eyes in the pilot, actually, in the way it looks and feels. I quite like this. I think Clint Howard delivered on this as the kid. Another couple of stories I like, both involve Vincent Price. There was The Class of 1999 from season 2 where he's a lecturer talking to people about the past, and it's kind of an interesting twist. And actually, one of the few that I like from season 3 was also starring Vincent Price, which was Return of the Sorcerer. I think it was the first one in season 3. There's not many good stuff in season 3, but this is one of them. Another one I quite like from season 1 was Make Me Laugh. And this is kind of a bit of an old crock now. A comedian can't make people laugh and he wishes he could. His wishes come true. You know, be careful what you wish for. It's one of those kind of stories. Jeffrey Cambridge and Tom Bosley are in that. I really like that. And Tom Bosley also in the pilot as well, in Eyes. So Tom Bosley's a recurring actor in these. Solid story. The only vignette I really like, I mean, there's a couple that are okay, but the only one I absolutely really like and think is terrific, I'm going to include in my list, and that is The Phantom of What Opera with Leslie Nielsen. Treat yourself. It's probably on YouTube. Go have a look, see if you can find it on YouTube. It's 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes tops, and it's a really fun vignette. The one vignette I think that really works well in all of Night Gallery is my personal feeling on it. A couple of others are okay, but quite a lot of them are quite dreadful and unfunny, and like, what is the point of that? But Phantom of What Opera, I really like. And then finally, one last thing I want to mention is another one from season 3 I quite like, which is Death on a Barge, where Leslie Ann Warren plays a kind of quite a fetching vampire, seductress, siren type, stuck on a boat. And, you know, a man keep going back and thinking about it. Now, there are lots of other episodes in the gallery I really like too. Mostly from season 1 and 2. I don't really like much of season 3. There's a few others I haven't mentioned. The boxer one with I can't remember what it's called, but Velvet Ropes is in the title. That's pretty decent. But mostly it's season 2 actually. And the majority of the ones I've mentioned that I really like. The reason that might be season 1 is fairly short compared to season 2, which is fair enough. But yeah, season 2 actually kind of was the high point of the whole lot. Though I have to mention, obviously, the pilot and tearing down Tom Riley's bar in season 1 are real standouts too. So that covers Night Gallery. No more Night Gallery. So I really enjoyed watching these again, and the quality wasn't quite as high as I remembered it, for sure. Certainly going into season 3. And in fact, a lot of these I've not seen before, I don't think, or at least if I had seen them, I'd just forgotten them, and you could kind of, that's perfectly reasonable given the quality of them. They're not that memorable. And striking. But yeah, I'm glad I got a chance to cover it, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to the coverage of the Night Gallery so far. But that's it for now. That concludes Night Gallery. We've still got a few more episodes of unusual shows that I've never covered before what I would call we hit the end of what I'd call phase 1. Phase 1 being I've covered every pilot or near as I can pilot from every anthology show that I feel's fit into a category. Now, there's always going to be new anthology shows, and I will bring those in as Phase 1 shows or when they pop up. However, Phase 2 is going to be a different beast. It's basically going to be deep dives into series. But there'll always be the odd Phase 1 episode as new anthology series come out. And they come out quite a lot, believe it or not. Okay, I'm going to stop there. But before I go, may I ask, is anybody out there?
I'm not.
We now return control of your television set to you until next week at this same time, when the control voice will take you to